The low mechanical hum of the climate control system in the East Wing archives was the only sound I trusted anymore. I adjusted the macro lens on my loupe, leaning closer to the 17th century canvas resting on the examination table. Under the harsh glare of the raking light, the topography of the oil paint revealed its secrets. The craquelure, the web of tiny cracks on the surface, was too uniform. A natural aging process created chaotic, unpredictable fissures. This was a forced fracture likely baked in a low-heat oven to simulate 300 years of survival. It was a forgery. I logged the anomaly in my digital ledger, my keystrokes sharp and precise. As an independent art recovery and authentication specialist, the museum had contracted me for the next 8 weeks to audit their incoming centennial collection. My job was to find the lies hidden in the brushstrokes. I clicked off the raking light. The archives plunged back into the soft, sterile glow of the fluorescence. I checked my watch. 12:15 p.m. I locked the examination room and walked the long marble-floored corridor toward the staff cafeteria. The quiet museum hall was a labyrinth of echoing steps and hushed conversations, a place where people spoke in whispers, even when there was no art around to disturb. As I approached the glass doors of the cafeteria, I stopped. Michael Meyer stood near the espresso machine, leaning into the space of 2 junior catalogers. He held a clipboard like a shield, his voice a practiced carrying murmur. "It's just a liability," Michael was saying, tapping his pen against the metal clip. "The board wants a public face for the centennial. The donors expect a certain Polish. She's brilliant, obviously, but the optics of having her run the floor tours, it makes people uncomfortable." I kept my hands shoved deep inside the pockets of my jeans. My jaw tightened, a dull ache blooming at the hinges. I didn't need to ask who he was talking about. I watched Michael for 3 seconds, memorizing the exact angle of his smirk before I pushed through the glass doors. The heavy thud of the door shutting cut off his sentence. I didn't look at him. I walked straight to the hot food line. I grabbed a black plastic tray. I ordered a scoop of white rice, a serving of roasted chicken, and a side of green salad. I took a standard white paper cup for coffee. Then I turned and looked across the room. She sat at the far corner table, bathed in the natural light, spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sophie Fraser. She wore a simple, fitted black top, practical for a long museum workday. The left side of her face, extending down the line of her jaw and disappearing beneath the collar of her shirt, was a landscape of textured, reddish-pink burn scars. She was reading a thick exhibition catalog, a clear plastic cup of water sweating on the table in front of her. She always ate alone. For the past 2 weeks since my contract began, I had watched the subtle choreography of the museum staff. They respected her intellect. She was the most brilliant curator in the building, but they gave her a wide berth. They left a polite, isolating bubble around her table. I adjusted my grip on my tray. I walked across the linoleum, the soles of my boots quiet. I stopped at the edge of her table. She didn't look up immediately, her finger tracing a line of text on the page. "If you don't mind, can I sit here?" I asked. My voice was low, devoid of the forced cheerfulness people usually used when approaching her. Sophie flinched slightly, her hand freezing on the page. She looked up. Her eyes were a sharp, intelligent brown, guarded behind a sudden wall of caution. She looked at my gray t-shirt, then at the tray of chicken and rice, and finally up to my face. She was waiting for the pity or the nervous averted gaze. I gave her neither. I simply looked at her, waiting for an answer. The tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. A soft, incredibly genuine smile touched the unscarred right side of her mouth. "Yes," she said quietly. "You can sit." I set my tray down and took the chair opposite her. I didn't immediately try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. I pulled the paper sleeve off my napkin, arranged my silverware, and took a sip of my black coffee. The sunlight warmed the table between us. It was a simple, functional proximity. "You're the new authentication contractor?" she said after a minute. It wasn't a question. "Logan Lawrence, you flagged the Dutch landscape this morning." "The binder analysis showed traces of synthetic ultramarine," I replied, cutting a piece of chicken. "That pigment wasn't invented until the 1820s. The painting claimed to be from 1640. Sophie nodded, her eyes lighting up with genuine academic interest. I told Michael the provenance on that piece was too thin. He insisted the donor's paperwork was enough. "Paperwork lies," I said flatly. "The chemistry doesn't." She looked at me for a long moment. "No, it doesn't." We ate the rest of our meal in a comfortable, steady silence. The background noise of the cafeteria faded into a dull roar. For 20 minutes, the invisible perimeter that usually isolated her was gone, replaced by the solid anchor of a shared table. When she finally closed her catalog and stood up, she hesitated. "Thank you, Logan," she said softly. "I'll be at this table tomorrow at noon." I said, not looking up from my coffee. "If you don't mind the company?" Her soft smile returned, reaching her eyes this time. "I don't mind." The next morning, the stakes of the Centennial exhibition began to tighten. I was in the sub-basement restoration lab, running an ultraviolet luminescence test on a marble bust, when Lillian Oliver walked in. The museum director was a sharp, pragmatic woman who managed the institution's fragile budget with an iron grip. "Logan," Lillian said, crossing her arms, "I need you to pull double duty. The board has mandated a joint setup for the main hall. You and Sophie Fraser need to verify and place the high-value pieces together. It's a shared obligation. If the authentication isn't bulletproof before the donor gala in a little over 3 weeks, we lose our major funding." "Understood," I said, switching off the UV lamp. "There's friction," Lillian added, her voice dropping. "Michael Meyer filed a formal complaint this morning. He claims Sophie is mishandling the archival logs. He says she's letting the relative humidity fluctuate in the storage vaults, risking the canvas tensions." I stopped wiping down my lens. I knew Sophie's work. Her precision was absolute. "Did he provide proof?" "He provided system printouts," Lillian said, looking tired. "I don't want to believe it, but I have to follow the documentation." "I'll handle the joint setup," I said, "and I'll keep an eye on the vaults." That afternoon, I found Sophie in Vault 4. The air was thick and cool, smelling of aged parchment and dust. She was standing in front of the environmental control panel, her shoulders rigid, staring at a flashing amber light. "It's reading 60% humidity," she whispered as I walked in. She didn't turn around. Her voice was strained, carrying a heavy weight of panic. "I set it at 45 this morning. If it stays at 60, the vellum manuscripts will start to warp. Michael was just in here. He said I forgot to lock the calibration." I walked up beside her. I didn't crowd her, keeping a careful 2 feet of distance. I looked at the digital display, then at the manual override switch beneath a plastic cover. "You didn't forget," I said quietly. I reached into my tool belt and pulled out an independent, high-precision digital hygrometer. I turned it on and let it sample the ambient air. It beeped. The reading stabilized at 45.2%. "The room is perfectly stable," I said, showing her the screen. Someone tampered with the sensor output to the main system, not the actual climate control. It's generating a false error log. Sophie exhaled a shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of the metal console. He's creating a paper trail. He wants the lead curator position for the centennial. He knows the board is already hesitant about me. She reached up a reflexive, defensive gesture, and her fingers brushed the edge of the scars on her neck. He knows I'm an easy target for public optics. I looked at the false error blinking on the screen. The urge to find Michael Meyer and physically remove him from the building was a sharp, cold spike in my chest. Instead, I kept my hands firmly by my sides. He's relying on digital logs. I said, my voice completely steady. I deal in physical proof. I pulled out my laptop, plugged a diagnostic cable into the environmental panel's hidden service port, and ran a raw data extraction. It took 4 minutes. I pulled the system's internal physical access logs, bypassing the altered network interface. Here, I said, pointing to a line of code. Physical override, engaged at 1:14 p.m. Access badge ID 0048. Is that your badge? No. Sophie said, her voice finding its strength. Mine is 0112. I'll secure this raw data, I told her, closing the laptop. I'll run a shadow logger on your vaults from now on. The actual climate won't change, but if anyone tampers with the sensors again, my system will record the physical badge ID in real time. She looked at me, the panic entirely gone, replaced by a profound relief. You don't even know me, Logan. Why are you doing this? I hate forgeries, I said simply. And I protect the real things. Over the next 3 weeks, our shared obligation in the main hall became the anchor of my days. We developed a rhythm built on silent competence. When we moved the heavy-framed portraits, I took the weight on the blind corners so she wouldn't have to strain. When she spent hours transcribing faint inscriptions, I quietly adjusted the standing lamps to reduce the glare on her work surface, never interrupting her focus. The warmth grew, not through grand gestures, but through steady, reliable proximity. We ate lunch together every day. Sometimes we talked about the chemical composition of varnishes. Sometimes we sat in complete silence, watching the rain hit the cafeteria windows. I found myself memorizing the way she organized her notes, the specific brand of black pens she used, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her right ear when she was deep in thought. On a Tuesday afternoon, the mounting tension broke. We were in the main exhibition hall mapping the layout for the 19th century portraits. Lillian Oliver walked in, followed closely by Michael Meyer and 2 members of the board of directors. Michael looked exceedingly confident. Lillian, I apologize for interrupting, Michael said smoothly, his voice echoing in the large space. But I felt the board needed to see this immediately. I was reviewing the condition reports for the Rembrandt sketch. Sophie went entirely still. She was holding a clipboard, her knuckles turning white. What about it, Michael? Lillian asked, her tone guarded. It's damaged, Michael said, producing a glossy photograph. He handed it to the board members. There's a fresh micro tear along the bottom edge. According to the handling logs, Sophie was the last one to unseal the archival sleeve yesterday. The room went completely quiet. The board members frowned, looking from the photograph to Sophie. The weight of the accusation, the threat to her career, her reputation, her entire life's work hung in the air, like a physical pressure. Michael was using a documented complaint to force her out. I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. That photograph was taken under standard gallery lighting. I said, my voice cutting through the silence with the precision of a scalpel. Michael turned to me, his smirk faltering. Excuse me, I am addressing the director. I am the contracted authentication expert, I replied, holding his gaze. I walked over to my rolling equipment cart and picked up a thick, leather-bound portfolio. And you are presenting incomplete data. I opened the portfolio and handed a high-resolution multi-spectrum printout directly to Lillian. I processed the Rembrandt sketch upon its arrival 3 weeks ago. I stated my tone strictly factual. I conducted an infrared reflectography scan to verify the underdrawing. If you look at the lower quadrant of my scan, time-stamped 21 days ago, you will see the exact micro tear Michael is referencing. Lillian studied the scan, her eyes widening. She showed it to the board members. The tear is not fresh. I continued pacing my words to let the reality settle over the room. It is historical damage, likely caused by acidic mounting tape used in the 1950s. Furthermore, the handling logs from yesterday show that Sophie applied a reversible archival-grade methylcellulose paste to stabilize that exact edge, preventing further deterioration. She didn't damage it. She saved it. I closed my portfolio. I looked at Michael. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on him. "Your condition report is inaccurate, Michael," Lillian said, her voice turning to ice. "We will discuss your methodology in my office. Now." As the group filed out, Michael's face pale and rigid, the heavy doors of the main hall clicked shut. Sophie let out a long, shaky breath. She dropped her clipboard onto a crate and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was trembling. I walked over to her. I wanted to pull her against my chest, to wrap my arms around her and shield her from the lingering adrenaline of the attack. But I kept my hands at my sides. I stood close enough to block the draft from the vents, offering my presence as a wall between her and the door. "He almost had me," she whispered, dropping her hands. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "If you hadn't taken those infrared scans." "I document everything," I said quietly. "You are the best curator in this building." I wasn't going to let him rewrite the facts. That night, the museum was empty. We were in the sub-basement restoration lab, finishing the final cataloging for the week. The external threat of Michael Meyer was temporarily neutralized, leaving only the quiet hum of the building and the soft scratching of Sophie's pen. This was our oasis. The high-tech tools were put away. It was just cardboard boxes, archival tissue paper, and the smell of dust. We were sitting on the floor between two heavy wooden shelving units, passing historical letters back and forth to place in acid-free folders. The lighting was low, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Sophie paused, holding a letter from 1882. She wasn't looking at the paper. She was looking at the concrete floor. "I was 12, she said suddenly. The vulnerability in the room spiked, raw and sudden. I stopped folding the tissue paper. I didn't ask her to elaborate. I just waited, giving her absolute silence. It was a grease fire in the kitchen. She continued, her voice barely a whisper. She touched her collarbone just below the edge of the scarring. My father tried to pull me back, but the oil caught the curtain. It was fast. She looked at me, her brown eyes carrying a decade of internalized rejection. Michael was right about the optics, Logan. The board wants perfection. They want symmetry. They look at me and they see a damaged artifact. That's why I eat alone. It's easier to isolate myself than to watch people try to figure out where to look. She drew her shoulders in, tugged the collar of her top a little higher over the scar at her neck, and shifted deeper into the shadow between the shelving units. I shifted closer on the concrete floor. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell her she was beautiful or that the scars didn't matter, because I knew that wouldn't erase the years of stares. Instead, I reached out. I placed my hand firmly over her wrist, where her fingers were trembling against the letter. It was a functional grounding touch, a transfer of stability. The tremor in her hand stopped instantly. The chaotic hum of her anxiety met the solid, immovable anchor of my grip. "In my line of work," I said, my voice low and absolute, "the flawless pieces are usually the fakes. The forgers make them too perfect. They erase the history to make them palatable to buyers who don't understand art." I held her gaze, making sure she heard every word. "The masterpieces, the real surviving things that belong in the center of the hall, they all have marks. They have craquelure. They have repair lines. That's how I know they survived the fire. That's how I know they are authentic." I released her wrist slowly, letting the warmth linger. "You are the most authentic person I have ever met, Sophie. Don't let a forged man like Michael tell you your value." A single tear spilled over her lower lash line, tracking down the scarred texture of her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She took a deep breath, and the heavy defensive posture she had carried for years seemed to unlock. 2 days before the Centennial Gala, the final escalation hit. The centerpiece of the entire exhibition was a recently recovered Renaissance chalice. It was insured for $10 million. I had authenticated it myself 3 weeks prior, sealing the provenance documents in the director's vault. At 4 p.m., Lillian Oliver called an emergency meeting in her office. Sophie and I arrived to find Michael Myers standing by the window, looking gravely concerned. "The provenance certificate for the chalice is missing," Lillian said, her face pale. "The vault logs show it was removed this morning. Without that certificate, the insurance underwriters will pull the coverage. We cannot display the centerpiece." Lillian looked at Sophie. "The digital log shows your override code accessed the vault at 9:15 a.m. Michael had played his final card. A digital frame-up. If the centerpiece failed, Sophie would be terminated for gross negligence. I felt the cold anger rise, but I kept my breathing even. I turned to look at Michael. "Digital logs can be spoofed remotely." "Perhaps," Michael said smoothly. "But we have a crisis now. I suggest we remove the chalice, and I will personally issue a statement to the donors apologizing for the oversight in the curation department." No. The word didn't come from me. It came from Sophie. She stood up from her chair. She wasn't shrinking. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. She placed it firmly on Lillian's desk. "When Logan caught the climate control discrepancy," Sophie said, her voice ringing with clear, undeniable authority, "he taught me that digital logs are vulnerable. So I instituted a physical chain of custody protocol for the high-value documentation." She opened the envelope and produced a bound physical ledger. "This is a triplicate carbon copy logbook." Sophie stated, opening it to the current date. "I moved the provenance certificate to an off-site bank safety deposit box yesterday afternoon, under Director Oliver's standing authorization for high-risk assets. The digital vault access at 9:15 a.m. this morning was empty." She turned the ledger around so Lillian could see it. Then she pulled out a secondary piece of paper. It was a printed photograph. "Furthermore," Sophie said, locking eyes with Michael, "I requested the security desk align a physical camera on the vault door. This is a time-stamped photo from 9:15 a.m. It shows Michael Myers standing at the vault terminal holding a cloned RFID badge." The silence in the office was deafening. Michael stared at the photograph, the color draining entirely from his face. His digital sabotage had met the impenetrable wall of physical proof. Lillian picked up the photograph. She looked at Michael, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. "Michael," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper, "you will surrender your keys and your badge. Security will escort you off the premises immediately. Our legal counsel will be in touch regarding the fraudulent access." Michael opened his mouth to speak, looked at the undeniable evidence on the desk, and closed it. He turned and walked out the door without a word. Sophie stood tall, her hands steady. She had defended herself. She had produced the documentation. She had won. The night of the Centennial Gala was a triumph of light and sound. The main hall was filled with wealthy donors, board members, and city officials. The Renaissance chalice sat securely in its illuminated display case in the center of the room. I stood near the back archway, dressed in a dark suit, watching the crowd. I preferred the shadows. My job was done. The collection was verified, the saboteur was gone, and the wing was safe. Lillian took the podium at the front of the hall, tapping the microphone. The crowd quieted. "Tonight is a celebration of history, survival, and truth," Lillian announced. But this exhibition would not have been possible without the tireless dedication and absolute brilliance of our lead curator. Please welcome Sophie Fraser. The applause was loud and genuine. Sophie walked up to the podium. She wore a stunning deep emerald gown. Her hair was swept back, completely exposing the scars on her face and neck. She stood under the bright spotlights, refusing to hide. She looked out over the crowd, her posture radiant with quiet confidence. "Thank you," Sophie said, her voice carrying beautifully through the hall. "We preserve these artifacts because they tell the story of human endurance. But true preservation is not an isolated act. It requires a team that values truth over convenience." She looked up, scanning the room, until her eyes locked onto mine in the back archway. "We are also announcing tonight," Sophie continued, "the establishment of a new permanent wing dedicated to marginalized and historically erased artists. The funding has been secured through the strict authentication of our current assets, proving their true value." The crowd applauded the Give Back initiative. It was a structural change, ensuring the museum would no longer cater only to the polished and the privileged. "And finally," Sophie said, her voice softening just a fraction, carrying a warmth intended for one person, "I want to publicly thank our authentication expert, Logan Lawrence. I would like him to join me here." The crowd parted. It was a public choice. She wasn't hiding me as a contractor. She was claiming me as her partner in front of the entire board. I walked down the center aisle, my boots quiet on the marble. I stepped up onto the low stage and stood beside her. She reached out in front of the flashing cameras and the wealthy donors and intertwined her fingers with mine. It was a solid grounding connection. I tightened my grip, anchoring her. An hour later, the speeches were over, and the crowd had moved to the reception hall for champagne. Sophie and I slipped away, walking down the quiet, dimly lit corridor toward the East Wing archives. We stopped outside Vault 4. The heavy steel door was locked and the digital display glowing a steady, stable green. The silence of the corridor was absolute, shielding us from the noise of the gala. The external chaos was entirely blocked out. Sophie turned to face me. The adrenaline of the public triumph had faded, leaving only a deep, earned calm between us. She didn't look down. She looked directly into my eyes, her thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. I let go of her hand and stepped closer. I reached up, my movements slow and deliberate, and cupped the left side of her face. My thumb rested gently against the textured edge of her scars. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, exhaling a long, shaky breath that signaled the complete collapse of her final defensive wall. I leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a desperate search or a frantic question. It was the heavy, absolute finality of a master appraiser setting down his loop after examining a canvas for weeks. It was the undeniable verification of an original masterpiece after a lifetime of staring at cheap forgeries, a complete, unshakable certainty that I had finally found the real thing and I was never letting it go. I learned that true value isn't found in a flawless surface, but in the documented history of surviving the fire. Have you ever felt safest with the person who looked at your deepest scars and saw them as proof of your strength? If this story reminded you of someone who makes you feel completely seen, please like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories.